Okay, I think we're live. Welcome to the Socialist Legacy. I'm Reed Kane. Thank you for joining me today. It is 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday. We live stream every week at this time on the Sublation Media Twitch channel. You can also find these videos, these recordings as videos on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, so Socialist Legacy, and they're also available as a podcast. I apologize if you tuned in last week. I was unfortunately not available. I had a conflict come up at the last moment. So sorry about that. I should mention at the top, I had an article published today by Sublation magazine that if you haven't already seen it, you might be interested in checking out, titled How to Rebuild the Party. And it's a response to another article that Sublation published, which I think I discussed on my last live stream, by someone named or pseudonymously monikered Zamuli. The article was called No Shortcuts, so I'm responding to that article. And it's I think it's of a special interest if you have been following this project or if you're interested in the work I've been doing, because I sort of lay out there the kind of the rationale behind what I'm doing here with the Socialist Legacy, what my kind of ultimate aspiration is with this project, namely to provide a kind of or at least, start laying some groundwork or helping to lay some groundwork for a kind of educational project around which a kind of serious Marxist politics could develop in the future. So if you want a more detailed explanation of how I'm thinking about that and what I mean by Marxist politics and so on, that article is a place to start. So I don't have a very solid plan for today. I've mostly been occupied with another article that I'm working on. So I've discussed previously several times on these streams an article I was working on about Seth Ackerman's blueprint for a new party and this kind of DSA strategy of working inside and outside the Democratic Party as a means of building an independent working class party, which is not actually the strategy that DSA is operating on in their electoral activity. It's actually quite I think it would be, for all the problems I have with Ackerman, I think it would be a substantial improvement upon what DSA currently does if they were trying to do what he's recommending. I still think it would be ultimately a dead end, but it's at least somewhat more serious, even if it's based on, I think, pretty flawed premises. The reason I haven't finished that article is because in the process of writing it, the argument sort of expanded a little bit beyond the scope of what I was originally intending. And so I've kind of ended up spinning it off into a few different articles. And one of them, the article I mentioned that was published today, grew out of that, as did this article I'm presently working on. And I'll discuss a little bit about what I'm doing with that today in a moment. And I think once I've sort of worked out some of these subsidiary points, I'll be able to kind of circle back around and put a kind of finishing touch on that Ackerman critique. I guess the reason that this sort of grew beyond the original scope is because in the course of developing this critique of Ackerman's orientation, it became clear that that article in particular is really only it's a strategy for building an organization, of building a party, as he imagines it, a new kind of party. It's a strategy that isn't kind of sufficient unto itself, but is really part of a broader strategy. And that broader strategy is, you might say, the kind of Bhaskara Sankara Jacobin strategy, which I've also discussed previously on this channel, which came up in his interview with Doug Lane on the Sublation Media YouTube channel, as well as a panel discussion he did with Ackerman and Mike McNair that I've discussed previously, and that he outlines in his book, The Socialist Manifesto, and which, to be brief, is essentially the notion that what he calls in different contexts a left populist, a kind of left populist electoral politics, or a class struggle social democracy, or social democratic politics, could serve as a means of reconstituting the social basis of a more radical socialist politics. Now, maybe next week on the stream, or maybe in a few weeks, I do want to look into Sankara's, into that kind of conception and the strategy based upon it that Sankara lays out in his book. So I might do that next week if I'm able to finish this article I'm currently working on. But to circle back around to what I was saying, I found it a little difficult to get at what was wrong with Ackerman's article without teasing out these kind of underlying assumptions that are rooted in this kind of broader strategy of using this kind of left populist, or broadly construed social democratic reform politics as a means of making a more serious socialist politics possible. So I'll get to that, probably next week. But a more basic point came out in the process of working on that, which was the question of how Marx and Engels and their followers related to reform struggles and reform, the politics of reform. Something that's always sort of bothered me in the discourse around contemporary socialist politics is this tendency to recognize the necessity of reform struggles while wanting to pay a kind of lip service to a more revolutionary orientation by invoking formulations like non-reformist reforms, or there are other similar formulations. I think non-reformist reforms is a very common one you hear. And I know that there are formulations to that effect by, certain socialist thinkers, or, revolutionary, political revolutionaries from the 20th century. And I'm not necessarily looking to criticize any particular conception that comes out of, one or another, that comes from one or another of those sources, but more the kind of general way in which that sort of idea is floated. So there's just sort of a way of trying to square the circle of revolution and reform, the struggle for reforms and revolutionary transformation of society, specifically through political revolution, by means of political revolution. That, I think a lot of these efforts just don't really have a kind of coherence to them. They just seem sort of like a hand wave. And I think the reason that that's the case is because it really doesn't matter. I mean, it's really sort of a, backseat driver sort of situation where, you can say whatever you want about reform struggles because there is no meaningful socialist movement, working class movement, seeking reforms on its own terms. It's more about orienting towards reform demands that might become relevant in mainstream political discourse, say by virtue of Bernie Sanders or, AOC, the kind of Green New Deal ideas, things like that. Or even under Biden, you had the I'm forgetting the acronym, but there was the labor reform legislative package that was floated, I think, the first year of Biden's presidency that ended up going nowhere. So, these things come up, and then you have sort of socialists, leftists, radicals, revolutionaries, ostensibly revolutionaries, trying to make sense of their own attitudes towards these proposed pieces of legislation or what have you. Medicare for all, of course, being a very common one that comes up. But they're doing so from a position of really complete political impotence. And that goes, as much for DSA as any of the less supposedly substantial socialist organizations or, non-affiliated socialists or what have you. So this question of reforms, I think, it's come up in the pages, or not the pages, I guess, because it's a digital publication, but it's come up in a few different pieces that Sublation Magazine has published over the months since it launched. And there are on a few occasions, there were invocations of the Marx's positive attitude towards the 10 hours bill in England, the legislation that first introduced limitations to the length of the working day, which was the basis of a kind of broader effort to limit the working day, both in England and on the continent. So I think Conrad Hamilton invoked this in an article. Matt McManus invoked this in an article, actually responding to an article by Will Stratford called "The Circular Logic of Bhaskar Sankara" that I mentioned in the last stream. And specifically, Ben Burgess, who I believe he's published at least one article in Sublation, and he also publishes in Jacobin and many other periodicals and so on. Ben Burgess mentioned that article by Will Stratford on an episode of his Call-In show. If you don't know what Call-In is, it's kind of a platform where you can have people call in to pose questions or have discussions or arguments with you live. And a caller who I've since learned is actually a listener or a viewer of this of these streams, challenged Burgess to respond to Stratford's argument because Burgess had expressed a very kind of strongly negative reaction to Stratford's article. So in that context, let me see. Let me see if I can just read a little bit of this thing that I'm writing, because I summarize it a bit here. So on an episode of his call-in show, Ben Burgess was prompted by a caller to discuss Stratford's article, of which Burgess expressed a very negative opinion. The caller argued in Stratford's defense that while Sankara sees struggle for welfare measures as a means of rebuilding the socialist movement, he wasn't convinced that history provided evidence for that position. On the contrary, he believed there was evidence that the socialist movement had made the most progress when socialists opposed the welfare state. Burgess responded with skepticism that opposition to welfare reforms was ever the dominant mainstream position of the socialist movement in any country. The caller invoked the Social Democratic Party of Germany when it was under Marxist leadership. The SPD abided by party leader August Bebel's dictum, "Not one man and not one penny for this rotten system." And if you've watched these streams, I think in almost every episode I've mentioned what Marx and Engels called the first and fundamental rule of their party tactics, which Bebel was essentially adapting, and Liebknecht also adapted, which the way they put that was, not a farthing for this government. So specifically referring to Bismarck's government. So the party abided by Bebel's dictum, and its Reichstag deputies voted against everything save measures that directly limited the power of the capitalist over the workers, such as limitations of the working day. This is the way the caller was kind of summarizing his understanding. He claimed this policy was based on recognition of a substantive difference between such reforms and, for example, welfare programs, such measures would make the working class dependent on the state as opposed to empowering them outside of the state. Burgess countered that such a policy may have been tailored to the distinctive conditions of Germany at the time, and moreover, that he did not see the basis of this distinction. Quoting Burgess, "I can see a sense in which you can say that universal healthcare would make people dependent on the state because the state is providing this important thing, but in the same sense that you're dependent on the factory inspectors to enforce the 10 hours law." Burgess thus implied that Marx's attitude toward reforms limiting the length of the working day should likewise apply to welfare measures, and that if Marxists in the SPD thought otherwise, this was likely a strategy crafted for their particular conditions rather than a general principle. So specifically that this had to do with the kind of sham character of the German Reichstag under the Kaiserreich, and specifically under Bismarck's chancellery, in which the Reichstag didn't really have any power to by means of legislation, control or limit the executive, let alone to, constitute a government or dissolve the government. All the Reichstag did have the only real power the Reichstag had, and this power was itself sort of not necessarily, it was fragile, so to speak. It could be. It rested on a very fragile arrangement, social arrangement. The Reichstag did have the power of the purse, the power to control the appropriation of tax revenue to fund the government. So the parliamentary representatives did act as a kind of limit on the Bismarck regime, but that's sort of well, it's a bit complicated. I don't want to get too much into the detail about that at the moment, but let's just say that it wasn't exactly the power over the purse rested on a reluctance to invite a potential revolution. But it also was reflective of a sort of tacit acceptance of Bismarck's regime by his political opposition, liberal as well, liberal and kind of conservative opposition in society, the Christian center, as well as the liberals. And then, of course, there's the Social Democrats. Now, the Social Democrats in the 1870s were, they weren't kind of lockstep Marxists. Marxists did have, Marxists had founded the party. It was the party of Bebel and Liebknecht, who were Marxists. Liebknecht in particular tended to earn the scorn of Marx and Engels quite often for various reasons. But at the end of the day, he was kind of oriented by Marx's and Engels's guidance and the education he received through them and through their work. And they weren't the only ones, but they did found the party. They were leading elements of the party, but the party encompassed a broader range of elements in society that had a relatively diverse array of attitudes, although they were oriented by a kind of agreement on a basic programmatic orientation. Now, this is where the critique of the Gotha program comes in. The Gotha program was the 1875 program of the party that was a revision, or it replaced the earlier Eisenach program with the intention of appealing to the remnants of Lassalle's party, which was in disarray and kind of disintegrating at the time. And Marx wrote his famous critique of the Gotha program, criticizing this effort to essentially appeal to these elements of Lassalle's organization by conceding things that they didn't need to concede in the way they formulated the program. So there was this kind of ambiguity as to the Marxist character of the organization by virtue of its programmatic orientation. But that wasn't there is this kind of emphasis, mostly from people influenced by Mike McNair and the Communist Party of Great Britain, although there's a similar perspective rooted in the Trotskyist tradition that puts a kind of great deal of emphasis on the program as defining the party. And that's not to, I don't mean to suggest that programs aren't important. But for Marx and Engels, the program was really secondary. It was essentially an agitational document. And what was really primary was the movement, the activity, the action of the movement, that was who the consciousness of which was sort of given and articulated through the program. And the consciousness is essential, but the program is not the only means by which that is articulated and developed and publicized. It's done in a variety of ways through agitational literature, publications, propaganda, and so on. And the program has a special role in all of that, but it's not the be-all, end-all of what constitutes the party's identity, so to speak. It's really sort of a derivative in a way, and should reflect the kind of level of development of the movement that finds its political organizational expression in the party. so there was a sort of heterogeneous aspect to the Social Democratic Party in the 1870s, before and after the Gotha program, with the Marxist, elements being leading elements, but not necessarily defining, not kind of exclusively defining the way the membership of the party understood its politics, and not just the membership more broadly, but importantly, the growing fraction of Reichstag deputies that the party was sending to the Reichstag. Now, around in the late 1870s, so I think around 1876, 1877, the Bismarck regime starts floating certain measures that are considered to be state socialist measures. There is this tradition of state socialism in the German, German socialist circles, going back to the 1830s, and Marx was always oriented against it. He was kind of an anti-statist Democrat before he was a socialist. And so he was sort of skeptical of socialism and communism initially, at least in Germany, because it seemed to him to be serving this kind of reactionary function of this kind of anti-democratic, function of giving the state a new modus operandi in this era when, from the perspective of good Jacobins like Marx in his youth, the work of the French Revolution needed to be completed where it was kind of left unfinished in Germany. So Bismarck is floating he's floating railroad nationalization and other nationalizations of certain industries, protective tariffs, and then a little bit later, essentially welfare measures. So accident insurance, pensions, unemployment insurance measures of that sort. But, and especially with regard to that kind of latter category, that is part and parcel of Bismarck's attempt to squash social democracy as it was becoming an increasingly prominent force in society and threat to his regime. So in 1878, I believe, he introduces the anti-socialist law, a law which makes the social democracy and its ideas illegal. And so the party has to go underground. It can't operate legally, can't hold meetings or publish newspapers or anything like that. It kind of lifeblood of its activity. It goes underground, but the Reichstag deputies are able to remain active, and the party's able to continue electing representatives to the Reichstag in a kind of illicit manner by running them as candidates who the voters knew they were voting for social democrats, but they weren't able to sort of publicly identify that way in their campaigning. So there is nonetheless, despite Bismarck's attempt to squash the party through this repressive anti-socialist law, the party continues to grow. But the other side of his strategy, besides these repressive measures, was to essentially placate or buy off, and Bismarck himself put it this way, to kind of buy off the working class. So he viewed the strength of social democracy not really as a legitimate political threat, unto itself, but more as a kind of disorganizing or a source of kind of disorder in society. So discontents that were arising among the working class were taking this kind of destructive form of social democratic ideology and the organization. which was sort of steering these discontents down a dead end that would just produce strife and conflict in society that would not lead anywhere productive. That was sort of the kind of reactionary, conservative reactionary view on it. So he proposed these welfare measures to placate the workers, to meet their discontents, to kind of recognize and to ameliorate their discontents, and to thereby undermine their support for the Social Democrats, and to undermine the appeal of the social democracy and this kind of revolutionary ideology. Now, the party was, as I said, it was still composed of heterogeneous elements. And in Germany in particular, you need to realize that the kind of liberal party was very weak and cowardly, as Marx and Engels never tire of emphasizing. And the only kind of serious opposition from a kind of democratic standpoint to the Bismarck regime was the Social Democrats. So they attracted support not only from the proletarian elements, but also from a kind of broader democratic desire for kind of democratic opposition to the Bismarck regime. And from among kind of the learned, elements of society, the kind of intellectual elements of society, and so on. And so when Bismarck starts proposing these various measures, the nationalizations, the tariffs, the welfare measures, there is this tendency in the party. There are elements in the party, including among the Reichstag delegation, that are kind of that in some way want to embrace these measures as a step in the right direction, as pointing towards kind of socialism, be it a kind of socialism from above, kind of state socialism. So this is met with a great deal of hostility from Bebel and Liebknecht, as well as Marx and Engels, and from the kind of newer generation of Marxists that are coming up in the party at that time. So that includes Karl Kautsky and Eduard Bernstein in particular. This is before Bernstein's revisionist turn, which would come later. So Kautsky, for example, in an article in 1881, writes that the article is called State Socialism, and you can find it on Marxist.org. In just kind of a pithy formulation, he says, state socialism is socialism by the state and for the state. It is socialism by the government and for the government. It is socialism by the ruling classes and for the ruling classes. The abolition of the state seems, therefore, the necessary precondition for the emancipation of the proletariat. So in other words, what's being called state socialism is, from the Marxist perspective, a means of strengthening the opposition to the proletarian movement, strengthening the ruling class's power as embodied in the state. So it has this, it emphasizes the class character of the state. Now, I wanted to read a passage from, this is from Engels's Introduction to the Civil War in France. Sorry, let me just make sure I have the right part here. Or it's actually listed as the part of his postscript to the Civil War in France, if you're looking at the Marxist.org edition, although I believe the text that they have there from Engels, there's an introduction and a postscript. It was actually just kind of one piece of text that, for some reason, Marxist.org divided up, for I believe. So the postscript to the Civil War in France. So Engels writes, or actually, let me. Okay, so I also want to read something else in a moment. And maybe I'm doing this a little out of order, so pardon me. I guess I assume you are familiar with the Civil War in France and the Paris Commune. If not, I apologize. You should read the Civil War in France. It's very good. Okay, so Engels writes, from the outset, the Commune, the Paris Commune, was compelled to recognize that the working class, once come to power, could not manage with the old state machine, that in order not to lose again its only just conquered supremacy, this working class must, on the one hand, do away with all the old repressive machinery previously used against it itself. And on the other, so specifically the standing army, the military force at the disposal of the state, or that was the state, if you will, as well as the police forces that constituted the repressive apparatus of the state, that constituted the part of my unconscious drift into Althusserian terminology there, but the special bodies of armed men that are the state, with the machinery of government being essentially this bureaucratic apparatus that grows out of the repressive forces of these special bodies of armed men. Okay, so from the outset, the commune was compelled to recognize that the working class, once come to power, could not manage with the old state machine, that in order not to lose again its only just conquered supremacy, this working class must, on the one hand, do away with all the old repressive machinery previously used against it itself, and on the other, safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials by declaring them all, without exception, subject to recall at any moment. What had been the characteristic attribute of the former state? Society had created its own organs to look after its common interests, originally through simple division of labor. But these organs, at whose head was the state power, had in the course of time, in pursuance of their own special interests, transformed themselves from the servants of society into the masters of society, as can be seen, for example, not only in the hereditary monarchy, but equally also in the democratic republic. Nowhere do politicians form a more separate, powerful section of the nation than in North America. There, each of the two great parties, which alternately succeed each other in power, is itself in turn controlled by people who make a business of politics, who speculate on seats in the legislative assemblies of the Union, as well as of the separate states, or who make a living by carrying on agitation for their party, and on its victory are rewarded with positions. It is well known that the Americans have positions in the bureaucracy, I should say. It is well known that the Americans have been striving for 30 years to shake off this yoke, which has become intolerable, and that in spite of all they can do, they continue to sink ever deeper in this swamp of corruption. It is precisely in America that we see best how there takes place this process of the state power making itself independent in relation to society, whose mere instrument it was originally intended to be. Here there exists no dynasty, no nobility, no standing army beyond the few men keeping watch on the Indians, no bureaucracy with permanent posts or the right to pensions. And nevertheless, we find here two great gangs of political speculators who alternately take possession of the state power and exploit it by the most corrupt means and for the most corrupt ends. And the nation is powerless against these two great cartels of politicians who are ostensibly its servants, but in reality exploit and plunder it. So he goes on to explain that the commune sought to prevent this, or to undo and to prevent the re-emergence of this kind of domination of the society by the state, and in this case by the political parties. Now, in retrospect, it's easy to recognize that what Engels was reflecting on here, in terms of the domination of the American political system by the parties, of course, it still continues, but it's no longer reasonable to say that the United States, does not have, first of all, it does not have a standing army. It has the largest standing military force in the world. That it has no bureaucracy with permanent posts. Of course, the deep state. Just I think earlier today, the news came out about the FBI raiding former President Donald Trump's home in Florida. And the whole saga of Trump's political career from his campaigns through to the present day, and of course, including his presidency itself, was characterized by this war of the bureaucracy against Trump and against his political allies, but especially against him as representing a kind of outsider that was, infringing upon their rightful control over the machine, the governmental machinery. And you better believe that if they're going to do that to somebody like Donald Trump, they will do far worse to a socialist party that even begins to make headway in the electoral arena. So the reason I read that is because, there is this character of the Prussian state in the 1880s, this kind of uniquely, so to speak, undemocratic character as compared to, say, the United States, in the sense that it is this feudal absolutist, remnant that has not been conquered by the bourgeois revolution, and that is characterized by this kind of massive bureaucratic machine, that has at its disposal a standing army and so on, which was, one of the kind of core tasks of the bourgeois revolution was to overthrow the state as a kind of bureaucracy, standing independent of society, unaccountable to society, dominating society, and subordinate the functions of the state to society by essentially getting rid of and replacing, in the case of the French Revolution, the English Civil War, getting rid of the feudal absolutist state machinery and replacing it with a republican machinery, in which the power of the state, the power of armed force, resided not in this bureaucratic machine with its standing military and police forces, but in the armed people, in a militia of the armed people. This brings to mind Ralph Leonard's piece in Sublation on the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, which is very good on this question. So essential to the bourgeois revolution would be arming the people to overthrow and replace this state machinery with a government accountable to the armed people, rather than dominating the people through this private professional military force of professional soldiers and professional policemen, who answer to this caste of bureaucrats, this kind of bureaucratic machinery. But crucial to Marx and Engels' perspective here on not only Germany, but and not only France under the Second Empire of Louis Bonaparte, but following the 1848 revolutions and the kind of reactionary, the kind of the counter-revolutionary response that followed their defeats, which the Second Empire was emblematic, but not the sole expression, was this notion that the fact that the working class had come out in open opposition to the bourgeoisie, seeking political power for itself, had led to a situation in which the bourgeoisie had reneged on its political commitments to kind of liberal, democratic, bourgeois revolutionary principles, to seeing through the smashing of the old feudal hangovers and replacing them with this kind of modern, republican or at least liberal social and political order based on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right to bear arms, etc. The bourgeoisie, seeing that their political ascendancy on this basis, had invited and, in a sense, had constituted the proletariat as an independent political force, both by providing them with the kind of political education through kind of recruiting the proletariat or the kind of proto-proletarian elements to the cause of revolution against the remnants of feudalism, by arming and training them to be the armed forces. Marx and Engels described the bourgeoisie at one point as an army of generals with no soldiers, so they have to recruit the soldiers from the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie. So there's this recognition, and then of course the social ascendancy of the bourgeoisie in the form of the development of capitalist production leads to a situation in which the proletariat, facing this kind of crisis of its conditions of labor and life, is moved to seek redress, first and foremost through kind of typical bourgeois means of organizing in society, but eventually facing obstacles to this process above, including political obstacles, seeking a political means to redress the situation. The bourgeoisie is now facing the working class, the proletariat, as a political opponent. And in response to this, they retreat from their revolutionary political inheritance and project, and in a sense abandon this kind of liberal, let alone republican or democratic, goal, and instead reconcile themselves to the remnants of absolutism and feudalism, or in the case of the United States, where there are no real remnants of feudalism. The kind of initial form this takes in the United States is the Confederacy. So there is this remnant in the form of chattel slavery, and the Confederacy was favored in the Civil War by the Second Empire of Louis Bonaparte, which sought to provide aid to the Confederacy. And kind of the project, the Confederacy, was to overthrow the basis of the American Republic, this Jeffersonian conception that all men are created equal, and replace it with slavery as the explicit principle on which the freedom of the rest of society would be based. So some men would be free because others would be slaves. That was the explicit conception of the Confederacy. So, if you don't already know, don't ever let someone tell you that the Civil War was not about slavery. But after the Civil War, of course, slavery is abolished, but then is kind of resuscitated, or at least the subjugation of the formerly enslaved population is continued in in a kind of transformed manner after the failure of Reconstruction, which not coincidentally, Du Bois in his book on Reconstruction described as, I think he describes it as the dictatorship of the proletariat in the South, which isn't exactly, maybe, well, that's a question for another time, but with the failure of Reconstruction, you have in the 1870s, late 1870s, 1880s, and then especially around the turn of the century, the Republican Party essentially capitulates to the Democratic Party and and the kind of, you might say, the more conservative as opposed to the radical elements in the Republican Party sort of make their peace with this new order, which, though formally Democratic and Republican, nonetheless starts to take on an increasingly imperialistic character along the same lines as the Bonapartism in France and the Bismarckism in Germany. So there does emerge this, and it emerges out of course, the domination of these political parties rather than feudal aristocracy. But there does emerge this bureaucracy, this massive bureaucratic machine with a standing military, and the democratic kind of mechanisms of the government are increasingly reduced to a sort of facade. So the president is still elected, but the executive power increasingly subordinates and marginalizes the legislative power, as Marx describes in the Civil War in France with the Second Empire, what occurs in the Second Empire. And so now you have this kind of situation where, there is this sort of Bonapartism, this kind of democratic Republican form of Bonapartism in the United States, which Engels saw emerging. I think he wrote this in 1891. Yeah, 1891. But it was already evidently emerging then, but the full contours of it weren't clear to Engels at that point, and maybe they hadn't fully emerged. It's really in the World War I era that it begins to kind of fully form, and its kind of consolidation is completed with FDR's presidency, I think you could say. And that's what progressivism really represents, is this kind of explicit Bonapartist project in the United States, as opposed to the kind of more restrained, or at least apparently restrained liberalism of the kind of pre-progressive or conservative elements of both the Republican and Democratic parties. So that was sort of a long-winded way of saying that I think that's why Burgess's point about, well, isn't this about Germany in particular, is really wrong-headed, because it's really a world historical condition, this kind of Bonapartist state, this imperial state, resulting from the failure of the proletarian revolutions in 1848, and then that compounding with the failure of the Paris Commune. That's where you get the transfer from France to Germany of this kind of center of Bonapartism on the continent. But there's also, importantly, England, which is in a sense, similar to America, despite not being a democratic republic, being a constitutional monarchy. It's similarly bourgeoisified in a way that a lot of the continent isn't, in the wake of the failures of 1848. Marx famously says in his, I think in the Hague speech at the conference of the First International, or the Congress of the First International at The Hague, that it was conceivable that you would have a peaceful revolution in the United States and England, because they are relatively bourgeoisified and they don't have this kind of developed bureaucratic state apparatus. So you could have the displacement of the existing governmental machinery by peaceful means, which, that's obviously not realistic anymore. And then you also have Russia, which for Marx represents the kind of font of of reactions. So there's a sense in which, for Marx, the entire course of the European Revolution, from really going back to the French Revolution, but then after, continuing after that, is circumscribed by England on the one hand and Russia on the other, where England represents ostensibly the bourgeois revolution, but it really represents this this ultimately counter-revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie vis-a-vis revolution in the rest of Europe, in funding and supporting the counter-revolutions, against, the counter-revolutions of 1848, and through a kind of more or less tacit or secret alliance with the Tsar, with the kind of Russian empire standing on the border of Europe, representing the threat of invasion, occupation, and the destruction of any revolutionary state that emerges, in the way that the Holy Alliance sought to destroy the French Revolution, the original French Revolution. Okay, so I feel like I've been rambling a little bit. I hope this has been somewhat coherent. I'm really sort of trying to think through some of these arguments I'm working on in this essay or this article. And I could probably keep going, but I worry I'll get less and less. This will be less and less coherent as I go. So maybe I'll take a break and see if Clint, or if anyone watching has any thoughts or questions they'd like to put forward.
Yeah, I think that was a great ramble there, Reed. So yeah, anybody watching, definitely drop some questions in the chat. One thing that I thought was interesting in getting into this deep history that you were bringing up of what's sort of informing this, we can broadly call, this progressive populist strategy underlying a lot of the millennial left. And I'll just point out, to kind of frame that, this idea that you've been critiquing with Seth Ackerman is very prominent still. In fact, there was a piece just published in Jacobin, basically arguing to do a repeat of that strategy now. But the problem being, so basically having like a Sanders type figure galvanizing a mass-based organization. But the problem being that the DSA is itself too anti-capitalist, and therefore potentially alienating various voters, potential members. And so it's arguing for an even more broad-based sort of mass organization to begin winning precisely those kinds of reforms that you were talking about. So with that sort of in view, I mean, it's something I think maybe we can kind of bring it back to the very deep history informing this. So, the U.S. Civil War, which you were kind of bringing up in the context of global Bonapartism in the wake of 1848, the way that a lot of people on the left today, which this the sort of the organization of the millennial left, the notion is that the line runs from Lincoln to FDR, that the line runs from Lincoln to progressivism, as opposed from Lincoln to Debs. So, so perhaps maybe you could talk a bit about how is this global situation of Bonapartism and this emergent class struggle that Marx is beginning to, theorize, critique, and show the historical preconditions of. How is this and the demand or the necessity of an independent working class party different from the sort of progressivism that one would find both in the U.S. context, but also ostensibly in, Bismarckian state socialism? where there's obviously certain social problems that the state begins to have to answer for on pain of um, social disorder.
Well, so on that point about Lincoln, I guess I would just say that, well, so there's this idea about the Civil War that is really, it's really the kind of Confederate or sort of post-Confederate maybe narrative of the Civil War, that you know what the Civil War was really about, or at least there was an aspect of the Civil War that was about the tyranny of the federal government over the states, which was long kind of feared, going back to the original American Revolution, and even before, that you could see, in a sense, the original American Revolution in terms of like the tyranny of over the colonies of Parliament and the Crown, as a kind of central government that did not respect their kind of self-determination, their autonomy, or what have you. And there was this kind of fear that the presidency, or a stronger federal government than was created by the Articles of Confederation, would reproduce the same sort of tyranny. And so there's this narrative about the Civil War, that what happens with the Civil War, maybe slavery is in the mix, and maybe that's unfortunate, but really what it's about is the tyranny of the federal government over the states. It's about states' rights. And in that way, the Confederacy is kind of framed in this sort of Jeffersonian way, like as if the Confederacy represents this Jeffersonian fear of this recrudescent tyranny, and this notion of the self-determination of the independent proprietors, specifically the yeomanry, but in this case not really yeoman farmers but planters, plantation owners. So that's the way in which, despite being explicitly anti-Jeffersonian, there is this way in which the Confederacy, maybe even at the time, I'm not familiar enough with like the literature of the pro-Confederate literature of the time, but certainly in retrospect, there is this distorted idea that, like, well, maybe the Jeffersonian ideal is workable, but in order to have this kind of independent citizenry along the lines of like the ancient republics, you need to do what the ancient republics did, namely base the independence of the citizens on slave ownership, right? So there is this idea that Lincoln, the Republican Party in Lincoln, represents the domination of the states as kind of expressing this self-determination of the citizenry in the South, where really that's not accurate. That's kind of a distorted narrative. Really, I mean, you could look at it the exact opposite way, and I think it would be even more correct to say that it was the slave power in the federal government that was really tyrannizing the rest of the country with, for example, the Fugitive Slave Act, this use of the federal governmental power to enforce slavery in states that had sought to abolish it, by allowing slave catchers to cross the borders. And then, of course, the question of the expansion into new territories of slavery, where it was really baked into the American, as much as people like to say that the Constitution is like a document that sanctions slave owning, and in a way you could say it does, with the 3/5 clause and so on. But the concessions made to the planters were, in the eyes of the founders of the country, necessary in order to set slavery on a course to abolition. That was the point, right? The point of making these concessions now was that in the long run, it would mean slavery would be abolished, or at least that it would it would wither away. It would cease to exist as an institution, if not necessarily. I think there was a desire not to have to legally abolish it and expropriate the slave owners that way. I think there was more of a desire to see it happen in a kind of peaceful, natural way, as opposed, this kind of bourgeois ideal, of a kind of gradual evolutionary change on the basis of like the free self-determination of society. Um, Naive, sure, but whatever, like that was the conception of the time. So there is nonetheless a sense in which, of course, the union does have to increase the power of the federal government over the states in order to hold the union together, right? I mean, it would be kind of silly to deny that. Now, the way Lincoln justifies that in Jeffersonian terms is by saying that, essentially the way Lincoln looks at it is that the Constitution, as important as the Constitution is not the be all end all of what constitutes the United States as a political entity. It constitutes the existing government, right? It's the document that kind of lays out how the existing government will be, formed. But for Lincoln, the nation is what's primary. It's the nation, the existence of the American nation as a political entity that makes it possible to have a constitution, right? The self-determination of the nation in giving itself this form of government, and before the Constitution, giving itself a different form of government in the Articles of Confederation, was an expression of sovereignty that pre-existed the Constitution. And the sovereignty of the nation was a result of essentially, you could say, of the Declaration of Independence, right? Although it's not really the Declaration of Independence is the expression of this kind of claim of sovereignty by which the nation constitutes itself. But it's really the revolution itself that is the act that backs up this declaration, right? So the Declaration of Independence sets out the terms in which the nation is declaring itself to be sovereign. And it's on that basis that the nation is then able to give itself a government. So for Lincoln, the states, while they do have a certain degree of political autonomy that has to be respected, they aren't autonomous of the nation. They only exist as political units by virtue of the nation recognizing them as such, giving them this existence, right? And so for Lincoln, there is no kind of constitutional basis for the states to secede, right? You would have to overthrow not only the Constitution, but you'd have to, in a sense, overthrow the Declaration of Independence. You'd have to, in a sense, overthrow the American Revolution itself, which, of course, is exactly how the Confederacy conceives of what it's doing, right? So if you look at the famous cornerstone speech of Alexander Stephens, that's exactly what he says. He says, this idea of Jefferson's, that all men are created equal, to paraphrase, it's a ticking time bomb that was bound to go off sooner or later, and it's not like a foundation that we should be trying to base ourselves upon. It was a flawed idea from the beginning, and it would be better to base ourselves on a different idea, namely slavery, explicitly. Okay, so I'm sorry that was a bit of a tangent, but that's something that I feel like that's something that always frustrates me when that's not understood. So I just wanted to kind of lay that out. But nonetheless, so Lincoln and this the crisis that makes this kind of increase and concentration of political power in the federal government necessary to hold the Union together, while in a sense being a kind of countermeasure to what you might see as the Bonapartism of the Confederacy, in the terms I was laying out earlier, it nonetheless expresses the same necessity that Bonapartism expresses in Europe in a different way. So this kind of concentration of power in the executive, in particular, is an expression of the development of capitalism. It's an expression of the concentration and centralization of social power, capital, in and the socialization of the production process. It's an expression of these dynamics at the political level. So that's sort of it would take. I don't want to get further sidetracked, so I'll just leave that there for the moment. Um, but the necessity that expresses is contestable. It's not necessarily, you know, it's not necessarily the case that like what becomes of the American Republic is going to end up reproducing the same dynamics that the Bonapartist regimes in Europe have. America is it's a kind of complicated case for a number of reasons, among which are, first of all, it's sort of pure bourgeois heritage, its lack of any kind of feudal remnants, but also because of its lack of industrialization and because of the relative strength of the domestic working class, at least before the 1870s, let's say, before the Civil War, but you know, um, but before say the 1870s, the relative strength um, the due to the essentially the lack of labor available in the United States. There is a small population, and there is a great deal of land. And part of what the kind of ideal of America was at the time was the promise of independence on the basis of the ability to become a proprietor of land, to become a self-sufficient proprietor, not necessarily as like a subsistence farmer, although maybe to some extent you're living on the basis of subsistence production, but really more so this um, kind of early bourgeois revolutionary ideal of the kind of free proprietor of land that casts off the yoke of feudal bondage, not only serfdom, but all the other kinds of feudal obligations that existed in the late Middle Ages. So that's sort of that ideal is there, and it's kind of a core part of the American political and social world. And part of the way that manifests is this relative strength of labor compared to capital. So America is not really an ideal place for investing in industrial production in before the Civil War. That changes after the Civil War, and you get the second industrial revolution hitting not just Germany, which is what is going on in the context of the Bismarck regime, but a little bit later in America as well as Russia at the same time. So progressivism is an expression of that. Progressivism is an expression of the political dynamics around this second industrial revolution and the change in the American political and social context that follows the Civil War and is bound up with this process of industrialization, which takes the form of the class struggle, the emergence of the class struggle in the United States. And so you could see, while the American class struggle is like relatively retarded, it's behind the curve in as compared to say Germany. Maybe a little bit more on par with Russia, although the context of Russia makes the development of a revolutionary approach much more salient because they have to contend with this, not just a remnant of feudalism, but in a sense, the kind of death mask of the old, the old regime in the czardom. So progressivism is really about, giving a political expression to the crisis represented by the class struggle, that can, in a sense, overcome the crisis that is, facing Europe, that has been facing Europe since the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune is seen as this kind of great threat to the existing order of society, and by virtue of which the same is associated with the First International and with Karl Marx, and then with the social democracy by association in Germany, and then the Second International. So it's not so much about like so it's really, there's this idea that progressive reforms are an expression of the strength of the working class. And in a sense, that may be true in some cases. But what they're really an expression of is the weakness of the capitalist class relative to this situation. In a sense, what they reflect is the need for the capitalist class to um, the dependence of the capitalist class on state power to stabilize society so that they can continue conducting their affairs. And what that takes, the form that takes, is illiberal measures, measures kind of um, that are kind of antithetical to the goals of the bourgeois revolutionary project. And that'll take the form, on the one hand, of repressive measures, police measures that restrict or even abolish civil liberties. The freedom of speech, can be restricted or regulated or even, curtailed in more dramatic ways through the use of police powers. But on the other hand, it takes the form of measures to buy off the various elements of society, including the working class, so that the discontents and antagonisms in society can be played off against each other, balanced with each other, and in a sense turned into a means of stabilizing the social order that they were disrupting. Right. So using these conflicts, using these discontents as ways of propping up the existing order. And that kind of project is not something that is like that that's very different from what the project of the bourgeois revolutions was, right? That was not the goal of the bourgeois revolutions. The goal of the bourgeois revolutions was freedom in society. So freedom of speech, assembly, association, and commerce, right? Freedom of commerce. But that whole project becomes unsustainable because it's precisely on the basis of these freedoms, not just freedom of speech, freedom of association, but also freedom of commerce for the working class, their right to organize economically in trade unions and so on, that comes into conflict with the same rights of the capitalist class, and where right meets right, force decides, as Marx puts it in Das Kapital. So that's where the state comes in. Liberal society undermines itself through the genesis of the class struggle. And so the state power has to come in to, in a sense, contain the situation. But that doesn't reflect the strength of the working class. It really reflects the weakness of the working class. It reflects the fact that the working class, as Marx puts it in the Civil War in France, is not yet able to take power, even though the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, are no longer able to wield political power. So it's really an expression of weakness in that sense. I hope that was an answer to your question and not a deflection.
No, certainly. So we got a question here from Stajan73. Should the working class demands on the state should the working class place demands on the state individual capitalists? If the demands of the workers would likely bankrupt a company, should we demand the state props up that company to satisfy the worker demands? Would that be a new reformist helping that capitalist class more broadly, or a gain for the working class?
If the demands of the workers would likely bankrupt a company.
So I think we would have to bring in the political dimension of this.
So should the working class place demand? I mean, so okay, let me back up for a second here. Marxism is not about telling the working class what to do. This may seem a little bit pedantic, but I think this is really important. And I go into this in the article I published that was published today. It's not a matter of should the working class make demands. The working class, I mean, we should hope that the working class is making demands, but really, more more typically, are you there, Clint? Okay, I thought I just lost my connection.
I'm here.
More typically, rather than kind of making demands, what the working class is reduced to is fending off incursions or fending off downward pressure upon its standard of living and the terms of employment, right? It's more about the working class is kind of more primarily driven by a kind of conservative impulse to defend itself against this continuous downward pressure that it's facing from um, you know from its employers and from society in general. So the idea of kind of making demands that would bankrupt the employer just on a kind of fundamental level, um, you know, that it would be great if the workers were making demands that could bankrupt their employers. But really, what we're talking about is um, fighting over the tendency to put downward pressure on the standard of living of workers in order to increase the rate of profit, increase the extraction of surplus value. Um, and if we're talking about, you know, so okay, I'm sorry. There's so many things bundled up in this question that I'm trying to figure out exactly how to approach it. Because then there's this whole question of the state. So like, okay,
Well,
let me, yeah, go ahead.
I don't think it's a question that can really be posed at the level of the individual firm. I think if we're still within capitalism with this downward pressure on wages and the exploitation of labor, it's actually often in workers' interest to not want their employer to go into bankruptcy. And so when you're negotiating over the surplus product, at least in the age of high imperial capital, maybe not the administered state that comes later, but you really can't bring it in. You can't just do it from the perspective of a single firm getting your more. And that's why you begin to have this, economic organization, self-organization of the working class via trade unions, via even larger into kind of pointing towards industrial unions already. And that's also what, that was like a strategy of the German SPD, or their trade union arm, where you would have to take out like one uh, like single battles, they called them. So you hit one while they're supported by the other, then go to another firm and do that, because you have to like raise the wage rate in total. And that's also only something that you can, as you were pointing out earlier, Reed, that's also something that can only be brought to the minimum going rate of labor per se. So it's not like you're going to go above the going rate of labor. So I think as a first thing, in answer to your question, Stejan, it's almost impossible to imagine demands from the workers of a single firm enough to bankrupt the company, because that would also just put them out of work in the context of competition amongst labor. So what we have to be imagining is what it would be the political conditions for labor to do what it's already doing, namely constituting society, but in a way that's not destructive of labor itself.
Right. No, of course. I mean, of course, it's not in the interest of the workers to bankrupt their employer. So, if that were like, if that's the case being made against, in a contract negotiation, say, if that's what's coming back at the workers, that say what they're demanding is threatening to bankrupt the company. I mean, this is a question of the specificities of negotiation in a particular situation. But of course, you would have to come back and say, well, prove it. I mean, prove that this is going to bankrupt the company. Because if it will, we don't want the company to go bankrupt. We'll negotiate and settle for something more realistic. But then that's opening the whole question of a greater degree of control over the labor process by the organized workers. But I don't think that that's really, um, I'm not, I mean, that, I mean, I would like to see a scenario where that plays out, because I think it would be important to look at the details of how that's handled in a particular case. It's all well and good to speculate on this in the abstract, but that's not really the point, right? The point is not to say, well, this is what the workers should do in this situation. I mean, it it would depend on the situation. I think in general, yeah, the way you're talking about it, Clint, is right. I mean, no, you're not going to want to bankrupt your employer, but of course, who would need to tell the workers that they don't want to bankrupt their employer? Of course they don't want. I mean, of course they. I mean, that would be just as bad as getting fired, right? So why would they? Maybe they're willing to risk it, just like they're willing to risk getting dismissed, or going on strike and not coming back, being locked out, something like that. Maybe they're willing to risk it if they're emboldened enough. But I think you know posing these sorts of questions in the abstract, I think, isn't necessarily helpful. And not that I don't appreciate the question, but I think it maybe twists what we're actually trying to talk about here a little bit beyond the pale, because we're not trying to say this is what the workers should do in this given situation. What we're trying to do is help clarify the broader historical context of the struggle in general, and how that comes to bear upon the struggle in its concrete forms, its concrete instances. So, that is a relatively broad perspective. It's not like this is what should be done in this given situation, you know, necessarily. But when it comes to this question of state power, that there is some bearing here. So when you say, so for one thing, there's a difference between demands on employers and demands on the state in that sense, right? Because we're talking about the difference between particular demands raised by particular workers in particular contexts, whether that be the employees of a given firm or workplace, or even as broad as an industry, versus in principle, if not in actuality, at least in principle, the working class as a whole and its relationship to the capitalist class as a whole. Now, of course, politics is more generally, we're more generally talking about the politics of a particular national context, not the working class as a whole. But the point would be that, when you're confronting state power, you're not just confronting the state power of a given national territory. You're confronting the political expression of the capitalist class as a whole in a particular instance, right? So I think so. Okay, so if the demands of the workers would likely bankrupt a company, should we demand the state props up that company to satisfy the workers' demands? Well, so that now we're getting to a more important question, I think a deeper question, which is, what should the working class expect of the state? But you can't just ask about the state in general. We're talking about generally what we're talking about is the capitalist state. We're talking about the state as an expression of the domination of the working class under capitalism, an expression of the social order defined by the capitalist mode of production. And that's defined ultimately by maintaining this, maintaining capitalist production, maintaining that social order. Now, the goal of the working class for Marx, of course, is the conquest of state power, to use state power in it to its own ends. But in taking on that role, the working class would need to do the same thing that the capitalist state does, namely maintain the capitalist production process. It would simply be doing it with a different set of priorities defined by a different ultimate goal. So just as the working class doesn't want just as the workers in a given, say, for a given firm, don't want their firm to go bankrupt, the working class in political power wouldn't want to just bankrupt all the capitalist firms, right? Or at least it wouldn't want to undermine the production process by which not only the workers are employed, but by which society as a whole is constituting itself, depending upon this production process, at the level of the social totality. That, which isn't to say that, of course, that doesn't mean there can't be interruptions or changes at the level of particular firms or particular, what have you. But you don't want like you don't want something of the level of a crisis of overproduction where you're undermining the integrity of the production process as a whole, or at least, or even in particularly large scales. You also wouldn't want something like the COVID shutdowns, which is a more not as dramatic in some ways, but you wouldn't want to undermine production at that level because it has dramatic consequences for society. Or at the very least, if that became necessary, it would raise serious questions of political leadership, of the role of the state in managing society, and that would be a political task posed to the workers, to the working class. So with the workers, so in the case of say the dictatorship of the proletariat, now there's a long tradition of expectation that when the working class assumes power, there will be certain industries that will need to be socialized relatively quickly as a political measure. And now that may take the form of the expropriation of the property of rebels against, rebels against the new regime, in a sense, confiscation of property of enemies of the state, for reasons of, political security, essentially, as in the French Revolution or the American Revolution. The same thing happened then. So you may need to confiscate the property of capitalists who are using their wealth to fund counter-revolution, to prevent that from happening. But there's also certain industries that are so central to the production process that it would be politically dangerous for the state not to take direct responsibility for them. And these are industries that are already more or less, if not under state control directly, the management of which is directly bound up with state power in integral ways. So above all, the financial system. But then, of course, you could list the other major kind of central, the commanding heights of industry, the old Marxist rhetoric puts it. But other than that, the dictatorship of the proletariat wouldn't be trying to immediately socialize all private property, not even large-scale capitalist property. I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to just kind of expropriate all smallholding proprietors, all self-employed, whatever, self-employed people that own the means of employing themselves. You wouldn't want to expropriate everyone. You also wouldn't really want to expropriate all private industry altogether. Ideally, what you would have is a political context in which the class struggle could unfold so that the direction it goes is the gradual socialization of the property that doesn't need to be immediately expropriated. And the reason you'd want that is because it would be the least volatile, unstable, dangerous way to proceed. It would be, to try to immediately expropriate all capitalist property would presume, this was the assumption, would create it would create an unsustainable political situation. It would be a crisis situation. Above all, because would the working class be prepared to manage the entire economy immediately? Probably not. It would probably take time to develop the capacity to do that. Both the capacity in terms of its manpower, experience, material resources, infrastructure, and also its education in how to run an economy. The working class does not presently manage even large-scale industries in individual forms, let alone as a totality of a productive system, at the scale of the totality of social reproduction. So it would take time to manage that transition, to develop that capacity and to manage that transition. So, in that context, um, you'd want to create a situation in which, at a certain point, capitalists no longer are willing to invest in certain industries, because it's simply no longer something that is appealing for them to do. Um, and in that context, the workers would take them over, whether that means in the form of a cooperative or in the form of a state-owned enterprise. It kind of depends on what we're talking about. There was a vision of, depending on the industry, depending on the enterprise, maybe it becomes a worker cooperative, maybe it is controlled by a consumer cooperative, maybe it becomes a municipally owned utility, maybe it goes under the control of the state government at the level of the state rather than the municipality. Um, there was a variety of ways in which property could be socialized, depending on what we're talking about. Okay, so I don't know if I'm answering the question now.
And also that we shouldn't imagine that all of these decisions are being made by some sort of central command authority, but what the dictatorship of the proletariat would be enabling is the working class, namely, which constitutes society, to begin to be able to start making these decisions within society.
Democratic deliberation,
Yes.
contestation, and the working class, we're not just talking about the proletariat here, right? There's an older rhetoric that has fallen out of use, but the working classes, right? There's the proletariat per se, like when we're talking about wage laborers employed by large-scale capitalist industry in particular, but capitalist industry. But not all wage laborers are employed by large-scale capitalist industry, large-scale capitalist firms. They're not all employed by for-profit enterprises. They're not all employed by private enterprises, profit or non-profit. And for that matter, not all people who have to work for a living are wage laborers or exclusively wage laborers. There are petty bourgeois elements. And then, of course, within wage labor, there are strata of workers who are insulated from their proletarian condition in various ways by, status as, professionals or management. I was reading today, there's an appendix to the second volume, I think, of Hal Draper's book on, his Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution. The second volume is about the politics of social classes. And one of the appendices is about the supposed theory in Marx's supposed theory of the disappearance of the middle class. So there's this kind of, one of the many misunderstandings or misrepresentations of Marx is this idea that how capitalism will develop it'll take the course of eliminating all elements in society except for the capitalists on one hand and the proletariat on the other. And there won't be any middle strata anymore. There won't be petty bourgeois. There won't be any of these other, there won't be, everyone will either be simply proletarians or capitalists. And that's just, there's really no basis for thinking that that's the case, that Marx thought that was the case. Marx never argued that was the case. In order to make that case on the basis of what Marx said, you have to take a few statements dramatically out of context, and Draper's discussion of this in his appendix is really good. But core to what he's saying there is that Marx well understood that the polarization of society between the capitalists and the proletariat is one thing. But what you're really talking about there is the political leadership of society polarized on the one hand between the proletariat, and on the other hand, early on, the capitalists per se as constituting this kind of core of the political leadership of the bourgeoisie. But, after the revolutions of 1848, the capitalists themselves kind of seem to fall into the background. And it's really the capitalist state that becomes central, the Bonapartist state that becomes central. But, the point of that is that there are a whole array of elements in society beyond the kind of proletariat per se and the capitalist per se. And that, so it's really a much more complicated picture than that. And under the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's not as if you're going to have a situation where, first of all, it's not like everybody who's a capitalist is going to be, imprisoned or like shot or something. No, there will still be capitalists for some time, you know, and ideally they will kind of either retire and not be replaced by new capitalists. Trotsky has this way of putting it in his great essay, "If America Should Go Communist," that we may need to send some of the really wealthy capitalists off to like private islands to live out the rest of their lives in luxury, just to buy them off, or something like that. But a lot of them will continue functioning, and they'll have to be subjected to political oversight as well as social contestation. It's not like you can just leave them to their own devices. But the same goes for all the other elements in society, these semi-proletarian elements, petty bourgeois, professional, bureaucratic, managerial strata. So, the other reason I brought up the Draper is because this whole discourse about the PMC, the professional managerial class, is really kind of powerfully anticipated by Draper in that appendix, because he's talking about this whole discussion of the PMC. It's really popular now. Is nothing new. I mean, they were talking about, there was discussion in the socialist milieu of the meaning of the emergence of the new middle class going all the way back to the 1890s. It's not a new discussion. And when they were talking about the new middle class, they're talking about really the exact same thing that people are talking about today with the PMC. It's the exact same thing. The way Draper puts it is the flaw with the way people are approaching this question in terms of the new middle class, or today with you might say with the PMC concept, is they're trying to group together under a coherent concept something that's not a coherent phenomenon, but really a kind of grab bag of various different phenomena that are only defined by virtue of their heterogeneous roles within a society, within advanced capitalist society. So these various different elements have different functions, different roles, different relationships to the different elements in society, that are in flux in general, but also that are not uniform amongst themselves in any given moment. So there's no way to really generalize about them as if they constitute a class or a kind of coherent entity at all. Really, all they are is a spectrum of different forms of different social positions that aren't simply proletarian or simply capitalist or any other older class formation. They aren't simply peasants or simply aristocrats or whatever. But they may share certain features with some of those classes. They may stand in certain relations to those classes. But it's really, it's a heterogeneous mixture. And that will continue to exist under the dictatorship of the proletariat until class ceases to exist, which is the goal, to overcome the division of society into classes. I just wanted to make one more point on this question, then we can move on. But, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't address this point. So, what should we be demanding of the state? We shouldn't be demanding anything of the state. The working class movement should not be demanding anything of the state. The working class movement should be seeking to conquer state power. Okay. And so that's, when we're talking about the state, we have to be clear what we're talking about with the state. We're talking about the police power. We're talking about the repressive power wielded by the government. Okay. The executive. All right. That's what we're talking about. Now, there's a difference between demanding something of the police power and raising reform demands. But the way that you raise reform demands in the Marxist conception is and we'll go into more about this in the future. This is what the article I'm writing right now is about. And I've already discussed this in previous streams, but it comes down to that kind of fundamental rule of party tactics, namely that you shouldn't do anything that increases the power of the state over society. You shouldn't demand anything that increases the power of the state over society. And that means you shouldn't be demanding anything that you know empowers the existing state per se, right? So you don't want the existing state to nationalize industries. You don't want that. That doesn't mean you can stop it if it's going to happen, right? But that's not the goal. The goal is not for the existing state to nationalize industries, because what that is doing is propping up the existing state, right? Now, that being said, let's say that happens. It's not like we would then try to have the state privatize those industries, because our goal is to conquer state power. And if the state wants to, do something, if the state wants to, increase its own power by, nationalizing, say, the railroads, it's not like it's in our interest to, to see that undone. Our goal is to conquer state power. So maybe you'd say it would weaken the existing state power if the railroad nationalization was undone. Maybe. I mean, there could be a strategic argument about that. That would be, in a sense, a liberal demand, a democratic demand in that sense. It would be a demand about restraining the power of the existing state over society. But the goal isn't to undo everything the existing state is doing. The goal is to conquer the existing state power. And so then there's the question of the strategy around that. But we're not demanding anything of the state. We may be raising demands in the legislature, okay? But we're not raising those demands with the expectation that, we're not raising those demands in hopes that the existing state will meet those demands per se, right? We're raising those demands in order to weaken either the existing state, in the case of democratic demands, or the power of the capitalist class over the workers, in the case of economic demands. But you don't want to weaken the capitalists while strengthening the state. That's a complicated proposition. At least it's hard to square that in the way we think about these things today. But it was very clear for the Marxists of the late 19th century what that meant, right? So I want to see if there's anything else anyone wants to discuss, but I'm going to be discussing this at greater length in the future. So,
I mean, effectively, the banking system was nationalized, socialized in 2008. But that doesn't mean that we're necessarily a step closer to socialism. I think a big problem is when we try to imagine a pure working class on the one hand and then the state on the other without the mediation of the party. And then the only way that people imagine the mediation of the party is in a sectarian fashion, instead of as the self-conscious expression of the working class and its historical task. Right. So are there any questions from people watching? Also, just curious, did y'all all pop in from another stream, or
Yeah, it says left flank vets is reading with a party of 200.
Nice. Welcome.
I've never heard of left flank vets, but thank you.
So just to kind of bring some context, Reed has been sort of diagnosing the strategy sort of mindset that underwent a lot of the millennial left. So if we're thinking in terms of generations, like from the anti-Iraq war movement through Occupy up until the Bernie campaign, that moment, right? If we're looking at how the every time that there's a crisis of capitalist politics, it's the opportunity for socialism. And so the struggle for socialism, and a lot of the millennial left, they had this notion that, you know, like Jacobin DSA, that we would have a populist figure like Bernie Sanders enable the creation of mass organizations. Um, and that has kind of fallen into sort of different tendencies within the broader leftist movement in the US, at least, where you have like base building, you have street activism, so to speak, and then you have electoralism. And those three haven't quite added up into a whole. And so one of the things that Reed has been sort of unfolding is how this sort of strategy where the Democratic Party becomes a means that socialists are trying to use to begin building up a mass organizational base actually itself becomes an end. And so we're actually raising this banner of socialism in order to subordinate the left to the Democratic Party and to usher people back into its loving embrace. And so he's been sort of unfolding a lot of the deeper assumptions of historical Marxism, of Marx in the context of the emergence of capital and the proletarianization of society. But yeah, so if anybody has any sorts of questions or concerns about that, feel free to.
And also, if you missed it at the beginning, I mentioned an article I wrote that kind of explains sort of the reasoning behind what I'm doing here. Was published today in Sublation magazine. I think that if you look at the top of the chat, the link, or was it? Oh no, it wasn't. Maybe I don't know if you could post that link in the.
I'll post it again.
Maybe I could. But it's called "How to Rebuild the Party," so that might be of interest if you're finding what we're discussing here interesting.
So yeah, I think so. And a big and a big question here though is like, is an independent socialist party of the working class something that's desirable at all? And then what would it mean to actually begin working towards getting there? And then what sorts of obstacles are sort of standing in the way? And a big obstacle is this sort of progressivism that's kind of what socialism means today.
Well, let me respond to that quickly, and then we don't have much time left. I will have to end in a few minutes. So, I don't see anyone raising any questions in the chat. So let me just say that this question of is it desirable? Is that desirable? Well, I think we need to distinguish between, okay, is that desirable for who? Is that desirable for socialists? Are socialists, people that identify as socialists, that have some attachment to this historical legacy, that identify with it in some way, to some extent, in some part, that seek to carry it forward in some way, do they see it as desirable to do this? So that would mean, do they see a particular aspect of this history as worthy of continuing or resuscitating, namely the project of Marxism, Marxist socialism, as oriented around this fundamental project of the independent political organization of the working class, the organization of the working class into an independent political party, as really the fundamental task for the sake of the conquest of political power by the working class. Is that desirable for socialists? And I think if it's not, I would say that it's only because there is a lack of a serious grasp of or engagement with this historical legacy. That people that are presently identifying as socialists have a very limited or distorted understanding of the history that they are claiming to inherit. They don't really understand the history of socialism, because if they did, I think they would either not want to be socialists, or they would at least be explicit in why they are not Marxists, even if they may be some other kind of socialist. A lot of people are willing to call themselves Marxists, or at least identify in some limited way with Marxism without really understanding anything about it. And a lot of people are indifferent to the question, but haven't really reckoned with it. So there's that. I think that they would either not want to be socialists or not identify as Marxists explicitly, as being anti-Marxist socialists of some kind, which would be clarifying. And maybe they're right, but at least it would be good for them to be clear about that. Or they would embrace this task and take it seriously. And when I say take it seriously, of course, there are, as I say in the article, there were all manner of attempts to take this seriously over the 20th century, to take Marxism seriously. And it resulted in countless different sectarian organizations of different tendencies trying to do that in some particular way. But the problem is that that approach in and of itself already belies the seriousness of their engagement with Marx, because Marx himself was utterly opposed to sectarian organization. He saw it as a total, not just a waste of time, but as a direct obstacle to the task of organizing the working class into an independent political party. And he was very clear that he had wanted nothing to do with the sectarians. And whenever he engaged with sectarians, he was, and him and Engels, they were critical of them to the extent that the approach you're taking is a dead end at best. At worst, it will do positive harm to what we're trying to do. So there's that. The other side of the question is it desirable for the working class, for working people? And at present, of course, it's not. I mean, at least if maybe there's some inchoate desire for something like that, it doesn't have an explicit form that they can attach themselves to, right? There is no manifestation of this desire in a concrete way. And maybe there's a kind of smattering of people among the working class, mostly, probably declassed intellectuals like myself, who, are educated in this stuff for whatever reason, who, know something about this history and maybe have some attachment to it. But for the most part, I think working class people are, either bound up with one of the, the kind of dominant political conceptions that are propagated by the mainstream media and that are orienting them towards one of the two major political parties, or maybe some minoritarian tendency like libertarianism or the Green Party or something like that, or DSA even, who knows. Or they're just not politically, engaged in a substantial way. They might have some kind of vague political inclinations or feelings, but they're not articulating those in any kind of substantial political perspective or project. So the question then would be, well, is there a potential for this desire to develop among the working class? Would it be possible for such a desire to be cultivated through developing recognition of the need for an independent political party? And how would you go about cultivating that recognition of that necessity, of cultivating that desire? How would you go about doing that? If there is, in a sense, the soil in which that seed could be planted, and that soil is fertile enough to sustain that seed growing into something. How do we find that soil? How do we plant that seed? How do we till it? How do we cultivate it so that it grows into something real? That is a task that will take serious effort on the part of people that are serious about doing this. And that's where the socialist intellectuals come in. That's what they need to be doing. And that's why I want them to have a better education than they presently get, because I want them to either stop doing what they're doing, or at least be clear about how what they're doing differs from what Marxism sought to do. Or I want them to take it seriously and do it seriously and understand what they're actually trying to do. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to do. But we'll see. Yeah, I think I'm being told I have to stop.
All right. Well, left flank viewers, we'll see y'all around. And thanks, Reed. And see everybody
Thanks,
next
Glenn.
week, 5 o'clock.
All right, take care.